Hello, Gen Con. My name is Teri. I am from Renegade Game Studios, and today we're going to paint some minis. I'm super excited to be hanging out with you here at Gen Con Online 2020. It's so fun. I think Sunday is a wonderful day to paint minis, and this is no different. So today we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of painting miniatures. I want you to, if you're one of those people out there who might be a little bit intimidated by painting miniatures, I want you to be able to watch this stream today and think, I can totally do that. You shouldn't feel like any of this that's being shown today is out of your realm. And also I want to show you kind of the basics, the basic tools, the basic good practices, good habits to form if you want to start painting miniatures. The other thing is this isn't just for miniature games, miniature war games. These are techniques you can take and you can apply to your meatballs, to any game pieces that are like molded plastic that are just a sad gray and might want some gussying up a little bit. So that's what I'm going to show you today. Today, I am going to be painting Mega Goldar. This is a big miniature. I'll hold it next to my face so you can see. It is the size of my face here. It's pretty big. And I'm going to be showing you on this big miniature because it's easier to show techniques on a big miniature, and B, if you're at all concerned about like getting tiny details or being stressed out about that, if that's an intimidating limiting factor for you for why you're not painting miniatures, getting bigger scale miniatures is actually an easier thing to paint. So you don't have to fuss about tiny details you can't get tiny tip of a brush into. With a big miniature, it's a lot more forgiving, so you're able to paint these figures really well. And Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid, which is where this miniature is from, is a beefy scale game. So most miniatures are 28 millimeters. This, I like to say it's about a 50 millimeter game. Just to give you an idea, this is the size of a kind of standard miniature, the size of the regular size, not mega villains in the game. This is Mega Goldar. He's quite a bit bigger. But also, when you compare it to some of the other Renegade miniatures out there, this is from Clank Legacy Acquisitions Incorporated Upper Magic Pack. This is Omen Drawn here. You can again get a sense of just how much smaller the scale is, and standard miniatures are a little bit smaller than that. So if you're looking to try something, you can go big. Don't be afraid to go big. I want to give a shout out to some of the folks who have said hi on Twitch chat. Aki Page, I believe. Thanks for stopping by. And anyone else, just say hi. I will absolutely call you out. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now, before you get started in any miniature painting venture, you're gonna need a few basic tools. Now, these don't have to be crazy expensive. They're things you can probably pick up at your hobby store where you get your games, at your local pharmacy, your big box retailer near you, the Walmarts, the Targets, that sort of thing. And what's nice about having these kind of everyday products available is that they're a little bit cheaper too. So the first thing you're going to need is brushes. Brushes you can't really paint a miniature with your fingers. This is as easy as it is. I don't want to tell you to go finger painting your miniatures unless that's the look you're going for. Okay, if that's the look you're going for, you go right ahead. More power to you. But I'm going to show you some of the brushes I have. They're not very expensive. So we're going to be painting Mega Goldar with a few basic techniques. We're going to be doing dry brushing. We're going to be doing base colors and color blocking. And we're going to be doing some fine detail painting. So typically with dry brushing is a technique that it's really hard on your brushes. It's really rough on your brushes. So you don't want to spend too much on dry brushes. If you can help it, I'd rather personally spend my money on miniatures anyways, and save my hobby dollars for that. So if I can get cheap brushes for dry brushing, it's a great thing to do. Now, my go-to dry brushes are old makeup brushes. This is like an eyeshadow brush that's like round shaped. From above you can see it. Because Mega Goldar is such a big miniature. I've kind of got it the same shape of brush for that. Again, round on top, really soft, fluffy. It helps make the paint kind of burnish on, go on really nice without looking scratchy. And these are from a makeup brand that's like a discount makeup brand. You can find it in drugstores and stuff, called Eyes, Lips, Face, or ELF. And you can actually see on the handles here, it says like, this is a concealer brush, and this is a contour brush for your eyeshadow. Super cheap, like $3 or $4 at the drugstore. Don't need to spend a ton of money. I've also got some craft brushes here. So these are just from like dollar store packs, from packs at like the craft store. They sell them in big packs for just a few bucks. You don't need super fancy brushes for base coats. Again, especially with a big model too, you don't need these two super tiny brushes with perfect points. You just need a brush to lay on paint with. And I have a couple extra brushes here. This is another like makeup brush for like eyeliner, I think. It's like a nice tiny brush if I want to do some very focused dry brushing. Dry brushing can be kind of a messy technique and gets paint everywhere. So if I want to put some dry brushing on a specific area, having a nice smaller brush for that is good. And this is like a really well-worn makeup brush that actually isn't a makeup brush. It's got a silicone tip. This is from ELF. They use it for applying glitter eyeshadow. So I use it to pull paint out of pots that are not dropper bottles. So the dropper bottles are easy to pull paint out of. But when it comes to these bigger pots, I like using something like this, because when it comes to taking care of your brushes are an investment. What you don't want is to get paint up into the ferrule of your brush. So the ferrule is this area here where this metal part meets the bristles and it's exposed. If you're using a brush to pull paint out, and you're dipping that brush deep in and paint is getting up into the bristles up here, it's going to seep in to that ferrule area. It's really hard to clean and it dries there. And what happens is your brushes, which are nice and, let's say they're shaped like my fingers here, and right at the ferrule, if you have paint that sits up in here and here and here and it dries, it starts to spread your bristles out and you lose the point of your brush. So one way to do that is to keep paint from getting into your ferrule. You can use like a little tool like this, again, super cheap, or you can just use the back of your paintbrush as well to pull paint, putting that back in, pulling it out, applying it to whatever palette you're using. Now, when it comes to palettes, I have some real fancy palettes, and by that I mean you can get this probably at those big box stores too, those drug stores, because my dry palette is a coffee can lid. It's just a plastic lid, nothing fancy, nothing special. You're gonna get paint on it. It's not gonna be something nice you want to put paint on anyways, so that's what I go to. Margarine container lids, yogurt container lids, whatever you've got. It doesn't need to be fancy. The other thing I have here is a wet palette that's been prepared. Now the wet palette is made up stuff that you can get really easily. You've probably got most of the stuff in your house. It's a tray. I've got a tray here. This is a plastic tray. You need something that can hold water. Okay, so that's the big thing. It needs to be a container that can hold water. Tupperware containers are really great for this. This is actually a lid to, I don't know if you can see here, an old chocolate box. That's as fancy as I get. You can buy fancier like wet palettes, but they don't come with chocolate in it. So I know what my preference is. And on top of that, I put a layer of paper towels, like a big square, just one square, folded it up to fit into my palette, and I put water in it to dampen it. I don't want it to be like super soggy. I don't want water up in the edges here. So if you actually can see, like if I squish it, water comes out, but it reabsorbs back into the paper towel when I relieve that pressure. That's kind of the level of water you want into your paper towel. Nice even coat on. And on top of that, there's this. This is a bit of baking parchment paper that I've laid on top. I've also moistened it so it kind of sticks better to the paper towel. This is a wet palette. Now, the wet palette does two things. It will make sure that your paints stay moist as you work with them. So if you're blending colors, it makes it easier to not like have them dry out on your palette, so you have to pull more paint and and mix more, which is really great. And it also, especially if you're starting out, a wet palette will help give you a little bit of moisture into your paint, so you don't have to try to figure out the consistency of watering down paint. It's something that is a learned process over time. It's really hard to demonstrate like to what level you want to water down your paint to, but if you're using a wet palette, it's a lot more forgiving because the moisture from the palette, as you spread your paint out to load your brush, will actually be mixed in with the paint that you're loading into your brush, and that will help kind of with the thinning of your paint down a little bit too. So we've got brushes, we've got palettes. I think we're ready to go. So let's get started on our model. Now this is Mega Goldar, big model. He starts gray. If you were seeing that figure at the start of the stream with that picture of him, he starts as gray plastic. I took some primer. You can use hardware store primer to him, but before I did, I washed him. You take a little bit of warm water, you put some dish soap in the water. You could take a soft toothbrush or like a sponge and just give him a little bit of a scrub. You want to do this with all of your minis. This is something that I wish I could tell more people about, and I'm so glad I can talk to you about this, because every miniature that is made like this, miniature produced for a board game, miniature produced in a factory, so mass produced, they are all set using molds with the material injected into the mold to fill the space, and then the material cures, and then the model comes out. Now, in order to facilitate that process, the molds are all coated with what's called a mold release, and that just helps the material from sticking to the mold and then potentially like ruining the model as you try to extract it from the mold. But that same product that helps pull models out of the mold, keep it from sticking, is also the same stuff that will repel paint from adhering to your miniature. So washing that off is really good. The other thing is primer will also help paint adhere to your miniature. So it can work in two ways. One, it gives you a nice base color to work off of, and two, it helps your paint adhere a little bit better. So if you've been painting miniatures and you're just having a hard time and you don't understand why the paint won't stick to the model as you handle it, that might be a factor. Your primer might be a factor. You don't have to use fancy primer for hobby models. You can use like hardware store primer. I've used, I think Krylon makes a matte primer, 2x matte, in like a black and a white and a gray. Those are fine. Just read the instructions on the can. Don't spray too close if that's what you're looking for. If you want a brush-on primer, there are a number of companies that make those as well. Totally usable, totally workable. And if you're picking it up from your hobby store might be also able to give you some support and what works best with them. Usually because there's people who paint there as well, or people in the community who've used that product who have a better sense of how that product works, particularly in your climate. Now, climate is a big thing, especially with aerosol primers. Humidity can be an issue. It can affect the finish of the primer layer, as can temperature, whether or not it cures well. So, read the instructions, follow them as best as you can. You don't need to sand your miniature. If your primer is like the hardware store miniatures recommend sanding and all that stuff, you don't need that. But you certainly do want to like follow the spraying instructions and like don't spray too close. That's usually how you end up over applying primer, and you can always do like multiple thin coats of the primer. It retains the details. Trying to get it all in one go usually means that the primer will build up kind of thick in certain places, and it leads to detail loss, and nobody wants that. The nice thing about having the miniatures, especially big ones, when it comes to details, is miniature painting as a whole is paint by number. It's not like you have to be a super artist to do this. It's not hard at all. Because I'm not painting. I'm just applying some paint right now. So what's happening right now on screen is you should be seeing me apply some. I'm pulling paint from my little paint jar. This is a dark kind of brassy gold color from Privateer Press or Formula P3. There are a number of paint brands out there. I use a lot of them. Find colors that work. If you're in your hobby store and you're overwhelmed with the choice of brands, these are all, if you're in the hobby store, what you're looking for is acrylic paint. Acrylic paint, because it will wash out. It can be thinned by water. Enamel paints need special solvents and that sort of thing. Getting involved in that gets a little more, it requires a little more investment. But these are really easy, beginner friendly. And so I'm just pulling some paint out onto my coffee lid dry palette here. So I've got my miniature, and I'm going to start dry brushing. Now what dry brushing is a really basic technique. So I'm going to take some paper towels and put them down here for you to see. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to load my brush into the wet paint. This is a dry palette straight from the bottle the paint came from. And I'm going to pull most of that paint off the brush. I'm then going to sweep the bristles of the brush onto the miniature, and it will deposit on the highest points. I like to prime black if I know that a lot of this miniature is going to be metallic. If you're painting armored, anything armored, and you know you're going to be putting a lot of metal details on, black is a really great color to start with for metal because it just looks more burnished. So I'm going to load my brush just a little bit. So that's what my brush looks like. I'm just getting it on the ends. Pull my paper towel out, and I'm just going to sweep my brush over the paper towel. Just like this. Here, I'll give you a good look. Until, let's see if this focuses a little bit more. Until the point where I'm sweeping, it's barely depositing on the texture of the paper towel. That's what I want. I'm going to take that brush over to my gold arm miniature, and I'm going to start sweeping that color right over everywhere I know I'm going to want gold. Now, I'm not being careful. I'm going everywhere. Yes, these feathers are probably going to be a different color, and yes, there's going to be other stuff going on here. If you're painting a miniature, one thing if you're starting out that I really want to encourage you to do is overpaint your borders. And by that, I mean, this isn't like coloring on a sheet of paper where you have to stay within the lines. Paint is its own whiteout. And so if you know you're going to be painting on top of that area, don't be careful about painting into where other colors are going to be later on down the line, because that'll cover it up, that second color you apply. And on top of that, it will make your borders cleaner. It's a lot easier to match two colors together with overpainted borders, and you can fake it a little bit better if you do it in that respect, by overpainting your borders and matching up, knowing where this gold is, knowing where it ends. If I've got red, which I'm going to paint red on the feathers of later on, knowing that I'm going to be painting the red right up to the gold, even if my border isn't perfect, there won't be this weird black line in between. And trying to match up one line to another, it's going to be a little more challenging. So overpaint your borders. You know that you're going to be painting another color on that area. It's also why I start with dry brushing. Oftentimes, if I've got a miniature where I know, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to do some dry brushing on it, I try to do that step first. Just because when we get to dry brushing after you've put other base coats on, trying to contain this technique into a specific area is really hard. And I tend to think that the smaller the dry brush, the less blended the colors look, the less finished the results look. It's more likely to look streaky, it's more likely to look more apparent, and it's more likely to look less like able to capture the illusion of light and shadow, which is ultimately what we're trying to do when we paint miniatures. We're trying to recreate the illusion of light and shadow onto a miniature scale model. Okay, so I've gotten that first layer of gold on. This is it's basically dry, right? So the paint isn't transferring because this is a dry process. It's really easy to do. Now, I'm not going to clean my brush in between here. Normally, I'd take this whole color and put it all over the model. Everything I know is going to be gold. This model is basically all gold. It's wearing armor all over. So I take it all over the miniature. But just for speed, I'm going to show you that we can layer this technique up. So I'm going to take, if we actually look at these two colors here, I have this darker brassy gold color, and then I have this really bright gold here. This is Polished Gold by Vallejo's Game Color line. Ultimately, I do want to mention here, I'm going to name the colors generally, but when it comes to your painting projects, pick the colors you like. Even if you're following a tutorial, say on YouTube or anything like that, use the paint that's available to you easily. Use the colors that you have on hand that are close enough. You don't have to follow to the T. This isn't like chemistry where we're trying to bake cookies precisely and you have to weigh everything in grams. Close enough to the eye is often just that, close enough. So I'm going to take that lighter gold color, do the same thing. I didn't clean my brush because if there's a little bit of transfer and a little bit of blending of colors, that's exactly what I want. But I'm doing this because I want to give the gold a little more dimension, and I'm going to just very gently sweep this gold across and highlight it a little bit more. Now what this lighter gold color will do is it'll deposit even heavier on those raised areas, and it'll just give that gold a little bit more dimension. And that's all we're trying to do here. It's just we're gonna, that little bit, that extra highlight essentially is what we're doing, is going to give that gold a little bit more depth. So there's one section done. Now this is a technique that I think you could apply to all sorts of miniatures, of models. If you're just looking at a bunch of like game pieces that are just gray, plastic, bare, and you want to gussy them up, you can make them look pewter with silver paint. You can take some of that silver paint, take a little bit of gold paint, maybe a little bit of red paint, make some rose gold miniatures. You can play with this technique a little bit and take what looks like what's gray, bare plastic, and even if you take your entire game set and you make your meeples look like they're metal, it just elevates that game piece a little bit more, and it feels fancy, it feels personal, right? You've personalized something and you've made it yours. Now, I've jumped ahead here. I've gone on and done those two golds onto this miniature here. You can kind of see how that looks here. Again, I've done it all over. The areas where I kind of know his face, his hands a little bit, they're not as perfectly done because I know I'm going to be painting over that later on. But I wanted to show you from here how to do base coats. Now, base coats are a fundamental element when it comes to miniature painting. So I'm going to move off of my dry palette onto my wet palette here. And I'm going to pull some red paint because I think his feathers are red, some of the armor plates are red, and I'm going to show you how to color block and base coat your miniature. Those base coats that we're talking about help, pull those specific areas of a miniature out. This is usually when you've got different colors, like you've got a cloth color and you've got, flesh colors. This is the stage where we're dealing with doing base coats, layered coats on. And this is where we want to work with water. We want to thin our paints down. There are so many companies that sell miniature paints, and none of these bottles have instructions on how to use them, and none of these bottles say thin me down, don't use me straight out of the bottle. But every one of them should. Every one of them should have some sort of product when it comes to these opaque colors. Like, there are like specialty paints out there. I'm thinking of Citadel, One Coat, technical paints, that sort of thing. Those are a little bit different, but when it comes to just standard hobby paints, you should all kind of work with them a little bit. You want to work with them to figure out how much they need watering down before you start applying them on your miniature. So I'm going to pull some of this. This is Sanguine Base, and I've got a Murderous Magenta here, and I'm also going to pull some red. Let's get some Scorn Red in there too. And I'm going to put pea-sized dots onto my palette, especially if you're working with smaller figures, but even with this size figure, I can always pull more paint out of the pot and work with small amounts rather than trying to, you can't put the paint back in the bottle once it's on your palette. It's really hard, and it feels bad when you know that you've spent so much money on this paint. So I'm going to put a pea-sized amount of the red in on this area of my palette here, and then I'm going to put that Sanguine base color. Let's see if I can pull this open and apply that over here. Right now, I encourage you to ask questions. I have Renegade's own Victoria, who is being fed into my ear. She will ask me questions. I'm happy to respond while we're chatting and hanging out this fine Sunday. So that is that darker kind of brownish maroon color. It's got a bit of purple in there too, which is really nice to work with. And I'm going to take that magenta color a little bit, just a little bit. Now this looks like it's a lot, but actually, again, it's a pea-sized amount, but it's spread out on a big white surface. It flattens out really quick. You don't need as much paint as you think, especially with hobby paints. Now, if you're using like craft paints, which is totally fine. I've seen a number of painters use that, especially with bigger models. Again, it's a little more forgiving. You can use craft paints. They sometimes have a little bit of a texture to them. They don't exactly dry in super thin layers. So that's something to be aware of. You might have to thin them down a little more. But hobby paints as a whole. So I'm going to show you real quick. This is all I've pulled out of that magenta color on the tip of this tiny brush. But when I spread it out on my palette, it just looks like a lot. That's half a pea size worth of paint. I don't need too much more than that. And if I need more, I'll pull more. So I'm going to take that color, and on my palette, part of the reason why I spread it out on this wet palette is it helps thin it out right away. I'm going to put a little bit of water onto my brush, and I'm going to I pulled a little bit of the excess, the drops out of it, and between the water on my brush, the water on my palette, the water seeping up from my wet palette, and the paint that's been spread out on there, it's already thinned down the paint enough for me to start, mixing and applying it. And that, again, this is something that's a little easier. If you wanted work on a dry palette, put a couple drops of water next to your paint, give it a mix, just because you don't have the benefit of all of this moisture on the palette itself, helping to thin down your paint. And Oh, you're not a baker. Okay, so Auntie Spell asked in Twitch, does water pass through the parchment? Yes, it does. It seeps up, but it doesn't. It's not like painting on a paper towel. So it has enough of a surface that the paint stays up over on top of the parchment without seeping right into the paper towel. If I was to put paint, you know what? I'll show you real quick here. The moisture wicks up, so you can actually see, this parchment has moisture in it. It's clinging, and there's actually drops of water that sit up on top as well. But if I take some of this paint here and put it onto my paper towel, so the edge is right here, so I'm going to just drag it right in. You can already see where the parchment ends and where the paper towel starts because of how it bleeds and soaks it up. The parchment works really well because it doesn't absorb the paint, but it does have just enough wicking properties to pull up the water. And that's all we're looking for. We're just looking for a barrier to help facilitate some of that water to come through, keep the paint moist from the bottom, while also, being able to work with it and make your paint workable on the miniature. So I'm going to take some of that. I'm going to take a big dollop of that magenta here. I'm going to start with it straight, I think. And I'm just going to start painting. I know these feathers are going to be at some of the armor plates are red, and I'm just going to start applying it on. Now, if this doesn't go perfectly in the first coat, that's fine. It doesn't have to be, and it probably shouldn't. Like, being perfectly honest with you, when it comes to miniature painting, oftentimes you'll have to do maybe one, maybe two, maybe three, depending on the color, depending on the pigmentation of the paint, coats to get like a nice, solid, even coat of paint onto those areas. If you want that kind of solid coverage, 2 thin coats, 3 thin coats, way better than doing one big coat. If you take the paint straight out of the bottle and apply it straight onto the model, yeah, it feels like you're getting done faster, but what happens is that paint doesn't have a chance to really dry evenly in a nice thin sheet, and that paint will actually settle into cracks, crevices, and the places where you want the details to be there. The paint, essentially what this paint is like a liquid product that goes through a chemical process when you apply it, which is, drying, and forms a sheet of plastic. That's essentially what it is. And so that pigmented plastic, if you're applying it too thickly, it might set too thick on the model. So by thinning it out with water, you help prevent it. It might bead out a little bit. It might not be... If you're finding that the paint is acting... it's not laying down flat. It's not going on evenly, giving you a nice coat like this. So I'm going to paint on these feathers here. I'm going to take a lot of water. I'm going to take a whole pile of water and apply it on here. And what'll happen is you kind of get a sense of just the paint is kind of adhering to itself. It's beading up. It's not laying down flat, even as I try to like lay it flat. It just means there's a little too much paint or water into your paint. But let that dry. You can paint over it again once that's dry. And most of that's water, so it will lay out flat once it is dry. Don't stress about it. If your paint is doing this, that's fine. It's easily remedied. Ooh. So someone is asking in chat about specific thinners, water, that sort of thing. That's a good question. I am cheap and I am lazy as a painter. Like, I like what I have. You can tell I use what I have. I don't like spending hobby dollars on stuff that I don't need to, because that means those are dollars that I'm not spending on cool toys. More games, more fun stuff. And so I just use tap water. It's perfectly fine. If your water is okay to drink, your water is fine for painting. Especially if you're starting out. Like, if you're getting higher up, like this advice is not necessarily applicable to people who are like in miniature painting competitions for thousands of dollars. Like, they have a whole other set of criteria. They're not painting for people to handle their models on a play surface, to drop them, for the cat to knock them off the table. Those people are painting to a whole different set of criteria. Their specifications are very particular, and their outcomes might be more affected by things like water hardness and minerals and that sort of thing. But when it comes to painting to tabletop quality, for game components, for things that you will play with, that you will handle, I have never had a problem with tap water. And I don't often use additives. Like, there are other products out there. They exist depending on what kind of paints you have out there, depending on what kind of techniques you're applying. Things like flow aid, retarder. I've used some of them. I have some of them. I actually have like a little hack for improving the flow of a homemade wash. But I use the stuff that's in my house. So this hack, and we're gonna talk a little bit about making your own washes and shades as well. This is dish soap. So instead of using a flow improver to thin stuff out, I just use water, and if I want to break the surface tension of that water, I just use some dish soap, and I don't use a lot of it. So, if you're starting out and you're new, don't stress about the water. Don't stress about. You might hear things like you want to use a different water for metal paint that you're going to be doing this kind of technique on than you would for non-metal paint, and that's. Some people who are high level, like competition painters, people who paint miniatures for product photography, absolutely care about contamination of like the metallic flakes in your water, potentially, potentially getting into and contaminating the water you use to thin your non-metallic paint, so it has this weird finish or sheen. A human cannot notice it from tabletop distance as a playing game component. If you're handling it, those tiny flecks are so minute, and the pigmentation on miniature paint as a whole is so strong that it's never been an issue for me. But when you take a picture of a miniature this big, zoomed up to be put on a package that is 8 inches wide by 5 inches tall, yeah, of course, every tiny little fleck is amplified. So that's what we're talking about when you see that kind of advice out there. I've never had an issue with just using a little cup of water. That's all I'm using to access to wash my brushes, then my paints. I'm not stressed about it. But yeah, that's a really great question, actually, because again, the point of this stream is for me to be able to show you that you can lose the fear. This doesn't have to be scary. Now, I've layered on that first layer coat. I'm going to put this down. I'm going to let it dry. It's really important. This is actually extremely important because you want to let your layers fully set before you apply a second layer to it. Water is a solvent to this wet paint. It's what makes it, you're thinning it out. You're essentially dissolving those paint binders and pigments into a thinner solution with the water. And if you apply thin paint onto this, if that first layer isn't fully set, it will dissolve that slightly wet layer underneath it, and then you'll end up with paint layers kind of picking up. Sometimes if you're not patient, and I've done this, I know from personal experience, the pain of this, where I was just impatient. I wanted to put a second layer on before that first layer was fully set and dry. When I brought that brush right over it, it actually pulled like a little section of paint sheet. So that little bit of wet paint dissolved with the water from my second layer, adhered to the brush, caught with a little bit of friction, just that little bit, and it pulled a little bit of the sheet section off. So there's this little, it almost looks like a chip of paint that came off the model. You don't want that, so you want to let this dry. And this is going to dry pretty quick. Don't fret about that. It's today outside where I am, it's raining, it's humid as heck, and you can kind of tell it's setting up already. One good way to check if it's dry before touching it, I wouldn't recommend touching it because again, you're disturbing the paint pigment, is look for shininess. If the paint looks shiny, that means it's not dry, it's still wet. So you can actually see here on this wing tip, there's an area that looks wet, there's an area that looks much madder. You want to look for these wet areas here. That's an indication that your paint layer hasn't fully dried yet. So Secretary Bird was asking a question. I was hearing through the voice in my headphones, not the one in my head. Victoria saying, does using a heat gun ruin the look? So use a blow dryer. First of all, if you want to dry miniatures quickly, I have done super fast paint jobs many moons ago when I worked for a game store and I had to finish a store project that would go into the display case for release. I was painting that miniature, trying to get her done in the mall, and I would run to the bathroom and hold it under the hand dryers to get it to speed up these drying layers. So it doesn't harm the model in the sense that if you're just using something that you can actually hold your hands next to, not an issue. I'd worry a little bit about, say if you've applied a shade or a really thin application, like your paint was very thin, heavily watered down. The force of the air might actually disturb how the paint settles, if that makes sense. Kind of like seeing wind on the surface of a body of water. It's the same kind of thing that would be happening here. And you kind of want to avoid that. But I've put my models kind of next to like the heating register or a little blow dryer, not too close to melt the model. Be careful about that. But like if I can stick my hand there, hold it, it feels warm, but it's not crazy. You know, that's a fine place for a miniature. So heat guns, be careful with them because they do create a lot of heat. But like a hair dryer, things that like, you know, blow heat at skin, if you really need to get some paint dry real quick, even if you run it and then you put the model like 2 feet away, this source of heat, the air, the fact that that air is dry, will pull the moisture out of that layer of paint that you've applied. I've often thought about like painting with a blow dryer on these streams, but man, blow dryers are just loud, so it makes for a bad stream experience for everyone involved. But yeah, so it's a good question, and I think that normally if I would be painting this miniature, I'd, you know, lay this layer of paint down and I'd start working on a different section too. So the necessity for feeling like you have to apply these paints and kind of like let them dry fully, you can still work on other parts of the model. If you're not touching those areas, there are like little holders for models that are smaller base than say this one, which is a bit of a behemoth, that can let you like handle the model, hold the model. If you want to hold it by the base like this and not touch any of the painted areas, you can actually manage doing that as well. That's not an issue either, and I'd just be working on other sections. So like the feathers would be going, and I'd be painting while those feathers are drying. I'd be painting and applying paint to say this area here where I know this armor is going to be red. These armor plates are have gold borders, but this area here is going to be red. And you see how, yes, this armor plate previously was just covered in gold, but that red will cover it right up. So I didn't have to be fussy about where that gold ended up because, again, paint is its own whiteout. So there we go. Ultimately, from this stage, I really want to show you what a second layer looks like, right? So we put our first layer down. I'm going to put my second layer down. I'm mixing a little bit of this red into that dark brown red color just so that it has something to adhere to. Usually when you're working up colors from like a black primer base, if they're brighter colors, having like a nice dark undertone as your first layer helps that brighter color show through a little bit better. It gives it something to not have to fight through the black, essentially, because you've got to counteract the black. And so I'm going to put this second layer on, and you can see how well it covers on that second layer. That first layer kind of, you know, is fighting the black a little bit, but that second layer, especially with that layer of pigmentation underneath, really comes through and really, really helps that color pop. And so that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to stop at this point because these feathers still look a little bit wet, but I just really wanted to show you what that second layer looks like and the difference it makes between like a first layer here, the second layer here. You can add a little more of that color. So if I wanted to bring this red straight up, make this the final coat of that color, I could do that after the second coat's dry, and it would be even more intense than if I just tried to take 3 layers of this red color onto the black, because that black would still be kind of peeking through. All right, so I'm just going to move on to my friend Goldar number 3. So here we are. We have Goldar. I've got the feathers done. I've got the armor plates, mostly picked out. Now we're going to talk about washes. Now, washing is a technique. You can also, a lot of people refer to it as shading. You can also use it when it comes to creating shadow. So we've painted the illusion of light with how the metal is deposited. We've painted on the color of the base coats. But what I want to do now is apply some shade to help create this illusion of shadow on the gold areas of this armor here. So I'm going to show you. And shades as a whole can tend to look a little bit splotchy if they're over applied. And they can also tend to be, to be really intimidating. But the nice thing is, if you're intimidated by making your own shade, I'll show you how to do that. You can buy bottled products already. They're called like shades or washes right there. It's a quick shade and wash. This is by Army Painter. Citadel makes a line of shades. You'll find most model companies will have something like this, but if they don't, that's fine. Use the paint you have. We can make one. So I'm just applying this onto my wet palette just because I want to be able to, if I need to thin it down, I'll have a place to do that. You can do it on a dry palette too. It really doesn't make that much of a difference because the intensity is pretty strong. But you'll notice that the opacity when I spread it out on my palette is quite thin, like translucent. And that's the point of this shade, is the translucent element doesn't hide the colors, but it will allow you to marry these colors together. Ooh, okay, so Mr. Dragon asked in chat, is there an advantage to making your own washes versus buying pre-made washes? And if you know that you have 100 miniatures to paint and they are all going to look the same, a pre-made wash, a bottled wash, and like along with a line of paints that you don't even have to mix. It's like, I know I want this blue for my base coat, this blue for my highlight coat, this silver for all the dry brushing on the weapons or whatever. Pre-bottled washes are just going to be a consistent product. You can open up the bottle, use it on 100 miniatures, and it's fine. For a game like Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid, for a lot of D&D models, for games where you just have like a set of like 4 player tokens that might be miniatures, making your own wash for the purposes of that particular mini uses the paint you already have, so you don't have to go and buy a new product, so that's economical and nice. And B, when it comes to character miniatures, my philosophy is always having the slight uniqueness to them makes them even more characterful, right? They're not all going to be the same. They're not all going to look the same. And that's kind of the point. They're supposed to be special, right? So I'm going to take this wash. I'm going to take like one of my big old art. This is a Artist Loft brush, came in the set. This from the craft store. You can probably find them at like dollar stores. I'm going to take this and I'm going to apply it across this wing here. And you can see how it will settle in the shadows and shaded areas of this miniature here. So where there is going to be a little bit of shade, where there's this little sculpt detail here, where this little circle is here, it creates this illusion in between these blades here. Now I'm doing this on top of the red too, and I'm probably going to shade the red just so that I have a little more definition between the shadows here. So I'm just applying it everywhere. You don't have to, you can actually apply it like more specific, kind of like a really thin layer of paint, so it doesn't run too much. But these washes, or they might be known as shades, literally do that. They create shadow. So if you actually compare these two wings now, this wing has a little bit more definition, especially where the plates meet up. They create this illusion of shadow on them, versus this wing, which kind of looks a little flatter. Now what I'm going to do to avoid this from looking too splotchy is I'm going to rinse out my brush, and I'm going to just take that wet brush and touch it to where it might look splotchy, and it'll pick up that wash without disturbing any of the wash that has settled into the shades, the shadowy areas. And that's all we're doing. The wash works in two ways in this manner. One, it helps create unison between the colors. So if you have like two colors that are side by side and they're shaded differently, the harmony of the model looks a little weird because it looks like the shadows of those two areas might not match up. If you use a shade product on both those areas, both those colors, that shade product will actually give the same color shadow across the miniature, helping the model look more harmonious with each other. All the little sections that you painted off will look like it's on the same miniature because all the shadows are the same color. It's the same. Ooh, do I lay my models? Someone was asking into it. Do I layer my models? I do. This is a fundamentals. This is a fundamentals kind of seminar, a workshop. I do. I paint models. So if we actually look at Omen Drawn here, I've used shade on him, but also for like his face area. And if this isn't showing up, I might end up doing a little bit of zoom play. I'll play with my zoom on here. Let me try to let's undo auto zoom and let this thing kind of focus on its own, the autofocus, because I can't trust you with autofocus. There we go. So this is Omen Drawn. So for this brown skirt area, I used a shade on a brown color. Same shade that I used on the gloves and that sort of thing. But if you actually look at his face has highlighted details. That's just because of the way I paint eyes as a whole. Shaded areas, just like layering highlights up. It takes a little bit of practice to understand where those highlights should go to look like they belong there. But it's not hard. One way to do it is if you actually look at your miniature after you've dry brushed it, you can see where that paint is depositing. So if I were to paint a highlight on top of this miniature now, by dry brushing that first layer, if I want to come in and say let's take this is like a super bright, this is the final, same gold that I used for the final dry brush. And if I wanted to take that and highlight it as a layered highlight, all that entails is me taking that little bit of gold here on a small brush right here, and I can see where it's kind of deposited, so I'm just going to strengthen that color a little bit more. Now follow the model, right? Follow where you've done the work already to kind of establish where the light is hitting. But all I'm doing is adding that little bit of gold, and if I take, say, a silver or a white into that gold to make like an extreme highlight for myself. So let's put a drop of white onto my palette there, and I will take that brush again, mix that with a little bit of gold. There's a little bit of water on my palette that I'll use by spreading it out, again taking a little bit of that moisture in there. And if I wanted to pick out that very top highlight here, this edge right next to the shadow, that's all layer highlighting is just adding more layers and building it up. You can build up that way as well. Like, don't hesitate. But I always find when it comes to determining that and seeing that and developing the eye for it, if you're new to miniature painting, it can be kind of intimidating. Like, how do I figure out where the shadows are? How do I control my brush to keep it away from where I know the shadows will be? When it comes to creating those highlighted areas, I find it easier to paint that base coat super bright, taking a wash to it and shading it down, and having the highlights, letting the model do the work, essentially. It's like just like dry brushing. I'm letting the model do the work for me. And if you're new, let the model do the work for you, because, you know, as you develop your skills, you'll build up from these fundamentals to do things like layered highlights. Maybe you'll get into wet blending, two brush blending, that sort of thing. So that wash applied on this wing, this wash here, we're going to make up really quick. I'm going to take a brown here, a brown here that's kind of similar in tone to the gold I want. I take a little bit of black paint, and I'm going to take some of my trusty dish soap. And I'm just going to make this wash right now for you. And all it is, well, when you're talking about like a shade for a wash, it's just a really, really thin down paint with a little bit of something to break the surface tension of the water, so that the water, so that your layer of wash flows into the cracks and crevices better than if you just applying it straight without anything to break that surface tension. Water will try to adhere to itself rather than into the corners. So a little bit of brown onto my palette here. It's kind of a gold tony brown. I'm going to take a touch of black, and I'm going to put the black somewhere else. Black can really overwhelm mixes of paint really quickly. So I always, as a just general approach, try to not not put my black directly in and just work small amounts with a brush into that color. So there we are. You'll actually notice here, this is the wash that I used in the bottle. This is the color of paint I've mixed. They're pretty similar. And all I'm going to do is add piles of water from my cup using my brush and pull that until it kind of starts behaving on my palette like the wash. Now I'm going to take my dry palette here. I'm going to put a teeny drop of soap. Bonk. That's all there is. You can barely tell it's on there. And then I'm going to take that brush that I mixed my paint with, dip the ends of my bristles right into that, and I'm gonna mix that into this paint here. And I really want to get this close so you can see immediately how this wash changes. So it's kind of adhering to itself. As soon as I touch the brush in, it breaks the surface tension. It opens up that paint and turns it into a wash. So you can see it's already flowing into the cracks and crevices on the surface of my palette, and that's the property we want to use. Again, I'm going to apply it out here. It looks pretty transparent to me. That's kind of what I'm looking for. I want it to look transparent, just like the bottled wash. And I'm going to apply that on this side here, just so you can see how that looks. And again, it's pretty similar. And that's the point. So if you have paints already in your stash and you're looking at kind of trying these techniques, you have what you need probably in your house. If you don't have dish soap, you can use shampoo. If you don't have the right colors, you're probably going to use, like, say, a brown or a black. Browns as a whole work really well for shades in general, except on blues. If you're using a blue, I just take a dark blue. Maybe mix some black, maybe not. If you're the color that you're going to be applying this wash on, a blue wash on, isn't like truly dark blue, you could get away with it. But you can also make a black wash as well if you're doing a very dark tone color that you're going to be applying this wash to. So here we go, and there it clings. It applies very similarly, and there you go. You get a rather similar result. I'm going to turn it this way so you can actually see here. So Mr. Dragon asked if the dish soap affects the paint's ability to stick. No. In the quantities that we are using it on, so you saw me apply this tiny drop. You saw me poke the very tips of my brush into that tiny drop and then mix that in there. It won't. All we're trying to do is have just something to break that surface tension. It doesn't take very much to do. But once you're done your miniature, and this is something I do want to emphasize, especially if you're using your miniatures as game pieces, you will be handling them. You do want to put like a protective coat on them. You can get like a matte spray varnish. Again, from the hardware store, you can talk to your friendly local game store, hobby store, if they have any like gloss coats or finishing coats. Protect your models, because the oils from your hands will actually wear down the paint on the models. That will slowly dissolve them over time, plus the friction of just handling them. So spray on that protective coat. You can use these techniques: dry brushing, base coats, and washing with very simple, easy to access tools. Again, like basic, budget friendly trays for palettes, some paper towels, some craft brushes, dollar store brushes, and some paint. You can get your miniatures looking great. We are just about done for time. My name is Teri. I wanted to just let you know that if you're looking for more support for painting, the Renegade Painters group on Facebook is a great community, super supportive. There's lots of new people. There's lots of very experienced painters there. They're all sharing advice, posting pictures of what they're working on. Super fantastic community. If you are a Power Rangers fan, I do encourage you to join our Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid community on Facebook too. Again, a very supportive, positive gaming community on Facebook. That community is just like the Power Rangers teams themselves. They're fantastic. And I do hope you follow Renegade Game Studios on Twitch as well. We are going to go live on our Twitch channel, /PlayRenegade from Twitch, with a panel on Athenaeum right now. So if you're looking for something to learn about a new game, really exciting, beautiful game, check us out over there. My name is Teri from Renegade Game Studios. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you soon. Bye.